Building fiscal leadership among local governments in an era of austerity, which of course is a very real issue for everyone in this society right now. And this is part of the ongoing series hosted jointly by ASPA and the Bedrosian Center on Governance. So before turning to the panel, I'd like to recognize Debbie Dillon, who's not here, but Paul Hubler, who is, and Jan Tang, who is, and Aubrey Hicks, who are the team that actually brings these joint programs to us every semester. So Paul, thank you. Jan, thank you. Aubrey, of course, is still working outside, and as I say, Debbie couldn't be with us today. And I think Paul wants to make a couple of words on behalf of ASPA.
Thank you, Dan. And on behalf of our chapter president, Debbie Dillon, I want to welcome you all here today. This is, I believe, the third event that we've co-sponsored or co-hosted with USC, and we're very appreciative, I think, of this partnership that we've developed and really revitalized with USC, and I think it's really helped strengthen the bonds, I hope, between the practitioners and academics who are members of ASPA and USC and the Bedrosian Center to help focus in on the important work that they do in terms of really elevating the issues that face us all as public administrators today, and particularly the hard choices that so many of us face in this era of, as Dan put it, of austerity. We are really looking forward to today's event, and I wanted to recognize a couple of our board members who are here. Lucine Shepard is here. She's on the ASPA board, and thank you, Lucine, for joining us. And then Shoshana Raskas, who's a student here at USC, and also the Vice President for Marketing and Communications. She's going to be putting together our newsletter. Finally, I just wanted to put in a little plug for an event that we're developing with the University of La Verne on October 28th. We're going to focus on the state's abolishment of redevelopment agencies and their proposal for these voluntary alternative redevelopment agencies. We've got folks coming down from Sacramento, from Speaker Pro Tem, the Senate President Pro Tem Darrell Steinberg's office, from the Legislative Analyst's office, and also the Chief Counsel for the Department of Finance to talk about the state's view. We'll, of course, have local agencies represented there as well. That's, again, on October 28th at the University of La Verne. Again, thank you, Dan and USC, for partnering with us on this event today.
Thank you, Paul. So turning to the panel today. First, I want to introduce them, and then we're going to go through the program. But I want to begin with Mike McGrath, who's the Chief Information Officer and Senior Editor of the National Civic League. And in his role, he edits the National Civic Review and is the organization's chief blogger. And I can't help but looking across the table here and saying it's great at this time in life to be a chief blogger. Second, Mark Pisano, who's a senior fellow here at the School of Policy Planning Development and has been for the last 3 years. And prior, he spent 3 decades as executive director of SCAG. Mark, thank you for being here. Bev Perry, who currently serves as executive director of the Southwest Megaregions Alliance. You might ask her about that afterward. She served as council member and mayor of the city of Brea from 1995 to 2004 in various capacities, and is currently involved in numerous community and regional organizations. And until last year, she was the assistant director of the Bedrosian Center. So welcome back.
Thank you.
Greg Devereaux. Greg recently became San Bernardino County Administrative Officer after serving as the Ontario City Manager since 1997. Greg, thank you for being with us. Martin Pluid, did I get that right?
Close enough.
How would be right, Martin?
Pluid.
Martin Pluid, excuse me. Martin brings his many years as a high school principal to his current duties as Assistant Superintendent of Personnel Services at Whittier Union High School District, one of the case studies we're going to be hearing about. So Martin, thank you. And thank everybody for being on the panel today. We're going to proceed with Mark laying out the case studies and the preliminary findings in these case studies with I believe Mike is going to comment on that also to some degree. Then I'm going to turn to questions. I'm going to turn to questions to to Greg and Martin and Bev from their perspectives, how they view these case studies and the issues they're raising, and have a little conversation at the panel. So that's going to start us off. But one of the major purposes of the panel is to actually be part of the ongoing workshop today that many of you were involved in on these case studies. So then we're going to turn it up to questions, comments to the audience, to the panelists, among one another. Does that sound good? With that, Mark, you ready to go?
Great. Can you hear me back there, or you want me to stand up? First of all, let me add my thanks, first of all, to Debbie Dillon and to the ASPA chapter for bringing the broader community into the work of these case studies. And Dan, let me also thank the Bedrosian Center for your willingness to co-sponsor this event and to further the refinement and development of case studies on how local governments can deal in this time of fiscal stress. Let me briefly indicate who the team members are that we've put together to do these case studies, why we're doing them, and what we hope the expected outcome from this particular body of work would be. And equally as important, to thank the funder for getting us off the ground, namely the Haynes Foundation, that's providing the funding for this first year, and we hope that they'll find it fruitful and that we can continue to refine these case studies. The team is comprised of researchers in the School of Policy Planning and Development, also from the University of San Francisco, and then from the National Civic League. And the National Civic League and the president of the National Civic League is also with us today, Gloria Rubio Cortez. And Gloria, if you could stand up, and Gloria's going to also pass out some information on the Civic Review, which is a national journal that the Civic League publishes on issues that are important to the civic world. And just by way of background, the Civic League was started at the turn of the last century to deal with corruption. The issue that we're really focusing on right now is how, in fact, do we sustain government in a different fiscal environment, as well as how do we get our younger people to learn to read, write, read within our communities so that we can track and have a civic future. That's the team. The leader of our team is Rich Callahan. Rich is now at the University of San Francisco and has done basic research in the area of leadership strategy, outcomes, how do leaders move us towards success. And we're finding that invaluable. Yan Tang, and I just am adding a little bit to some of the introductions, Dan. Yan is the research director for the Bedrosian Center and is truly an expert and has been schooled by a Nobel Prize winner in the area of how do you do case studies and draw conclusions from them that are valuable. Mike will speak. Gloria I've spoken to, and I'm the last part of the team. Why studies on fiscal sustainability? If you look in the handout, and you have the same material that a peer review panel that we have convened that's looking at these case studies more in depth and giving us feedback on how we can frame them so that we can in fact achieve our objective. Why we started on this is really described in the package on page 4 of 13, and it's the context that we find that we're living in right now. As part of our research effort, we've documented that context. And there's a very palpable debate within our country, within our state, and that is this a law? Is this permanent? Regardless of what you think on that debate, if you look at the facts that before you, we're going to be living this with the issue of stress on the civic environment, on government environment for a long, long time to come. And it has very little to do with this. Let me retrace. It has a fair amount to do with the cycle, but the cycle is only one piece of what is influencing the fiscal stress in America, in the state of California and our local jurisdictions. The purpose for these case studies was, can we, by looking through case study, get our hands around what are the fundamental themes, practices that is changing the civic public life in Southern California. We hope to extend this to Northern California and to other places in America. Looking past at what we did in the past is not going to help us for what we're going to be confronting in the future, because everything is so fundamentally changing that statistical and quantitative evaluations of the past we felt wouldn't give us the leadership insights to move forward. And furthermore, most initiative movements are not drowning themselves in what are the best practitioners in America doing, in our local area doing to really address the issues that they see. It's a leadership issue. It's not a quantitative looking at the past. And furthermore, the only way you can really get a handle on leadership is to look through case studies. We've looked at four different case studies. I'm going to let Mike describe three. I'm going to briefly describe one. I did the County of Los Angeles. Our team interviewed past CEOs, past CAOs, and the new CEO. We looked at we've talked to a number of other individuals, both that are inputting into the process as well as that are being affected by the process. And basically what we found are a couple of themes. The first theme is the rules of the game for what is fiscal sustainability and how we achieve it are changing, and it's changing the culture of government. And let me repeat that, the culture of government, not just the operations, and not just the behavior of government, but the culture. And what does that mean? It means what is government trying to achieve, how does it achieve it, and furthermore, how can we move forward and meet society's needs at the same time experiencing the fact that we're having to either define ourselves or redefine ourselves in order to meet those needs. What are some of those rules of the game? The first is you don't spend money long-term that is short-term money or that you don't have. And you get full agreement on that and you understand it before you put it in your budget. Secondly, you look at 20 to 30-year implications. If you make a capital investment, you need to know what the O&M, replacement, and other costs are before you make that investment. Stated differently, you manage not for growth in government, but you manage for how you change the way government operates. A third cultural, or another principle is the principle of takeaway negotiations. If there are going to be increases somewhere in your decision making, then you have to take away some elsewhere, because you're not going to have the kind of infinite growth and the dependable growth that we've had in the past. Another principle is trust, transparency, and full disclosure, and financial fluency is in fact essential in the way a government operates. And that without building trust, and how do you build trust? It's got to be trust between the executive and the legislative, between the manager and the board. It has to be transparency in how that jurisdiction operates within the public so that they know the facts, the financial facts and the performance facts of what you do. Okay, another fundamental change that we are finding, and that is outcome performance-based decision making is essential and critical. And if you can't relate your resources to what you're accomplishing, you don't have the criteria or the litmus against which you can in fact determine financial fluency and financial sustainability. So the notion of being able to bring the public in, and for different sizes of organization have different needs for that involvement. The last two principles, the notion of partnerships. Whether you partner with other governmental entities, whether you partner with nonprofits, whether those entities bring in the private sector and how they bring it in is going to be absolutely essential. And the last principle was a great deal of inventiveness and creativeness with respect to bringing financial resources to the table. You can read these. Those are my assessments from the LA County. Mike will summarize the other two. And let me just conclude, how will this work be used? It's our intent that these case studies will illuminate well, first of all, will be a report that goes to the Haynes Foundation, so we fulfill our commitment. Secondly, and important to the research is it will go to the participating bodies, to the Civic League, and they produce the model city and county charter. They produce what is called the Civic Index. What are those things that are necessary to run a good, well-performing city, county, or region? And furthermore, it'll go into criteria that they use for selecting all American cities and counties each year who are the best practices within America. So we'll have vehicles to distribute it in a national form. We'll also, one of the reasons for having the ASPA partnership is this information will go to you, to your members, so that you, as you practice in the field, as you are leaders and decision makers, that you'll have guides and frameworks for, in fact, how you will deal with what probably will be a 2 or 3 or even longer term issue for us. And let me turn it over to Mike.
Thank you, Mark.
Do I need to stand up? Or?
If it's
Can you hear
for
me
you,
this way? Or?
Mike, can you?
Oh,
In the
should
back,
stand up?
it's hard.
Okay. So Mark talked a little bit about Los Angeles County. The other 3 jurisdictions that we looked at are the city of Brea, which is in Orange County, a city of about 40,000. City of Long Beach, LA County, 462,000. And the Whittier Union High School District, which has a student population of, what, 13,400? So these are very different kinds of organizations, and what we're trying to do is to find out if there are common themes that emerge across these 4 different kinds of organizations, to see if we can come up with some sort of ideas about how communities and cities and counties and school districts sort of grapple with this ongoing, perpetual financial crisis that seems to have afflicted the whole country now, but California for maybe 20 years or longer. And I think you can find that there's some very different ways of approaching the basic problem of trying to come up with mechanisms that create a fiscal sustainability. Now, we talked earlier this morning in our peer review group about how we haven't really defined what fiscal sustainability means. But in my own head, I had thought of it as something fairly simply, thinking back to Dickens and the idea that if you make a certain amount of money and it equals the amount of money the outgo, then you don't go to debtor's prison. So fiscal sustainability for me, that's a very bad paraphrasing of what Mr. McCarver said, but you get the very idea. So for me, the idea that both Brea and City of Long Beach have been trying to struggle with for almost 10 years is eliminating their structural deficit. In other words, stop plugging the holes with one-time revenue sources, and make sure that your ongoing revenues match your ongoing costs. And this has involved both looking for new revenue sources where possible, and also in making pretty significant cutbacks. And Whittier High School too has done a lot, taken a very fiscally conservative approach and done a lot with that, and without really having a major impact on their outcomes. Long Beach has really had a sort of a 2-phase way of trying to deal with this question. And one of the things that interests me as working for the National Civic League is to what extent does public engagement, civic engagement, enter into the solution to this problem. And in Long Beach back in 2003, they went through a very extensive public engagement process to try to come up with priorities and ideas for how they were going to address this fiscal crisis. And they did that in 2 ways. They had large-scale public meetings where people met in larger groups and talked about the whole sort of overarching question, and then they would meet in smaller groups at tables like these and come up with ideas and then report out. They also had a very extensive survey process called Voice Your Choice, where
large numbers of people in the city were asked to come up with some ideas and solutions. They went through that process. They thought they'd been pretty successful in addressing this structural deficit, and they had in fact done that. But then along comes 2008, another fiscal financial crisis, and they're back in that very high deficit position, trying to come up with different ideas and strategies for dealing with that. And of course now the main crisis, or the main challenge they're facing, is their public employee benefits and salaries packages that they have to make more sustainable. And in doing so, they're having to renegotiate to the extent that it's possible for them to do that with the employee unions. And they've achieved some success in doing that. But the strategy in this case hasn't been as much a public engagement, sort of collaborative process, but more kind of a more traditional sort of political leadership. In Long Beach, they adapted the city charter. It's a city manager, city council form of government, but they gave the mayor enhanced powers to deal with the budget. He has the power to review the city manager's budget for several months and come up with recommendations. And then he has a veto power over what the city council comes up with. City council can override his veto. And the current mayor, Bob Foster, who comes from private industry, is a very fiscally conservative political leader, and he has achieved some success in using that enhanced mayoral power and sort of the bully pulpit and negotiating with the different parties involved to try to come up with some changes in the budget situation. Now, City of Brea is a very different kind of approach to leadership. It's a traditional city council, city manager form of government. It's a smaller suburban community, less diverse, not as much poverty within the city. And it has a fairly established tradition of innovation when it comes to professional management leadership styles. For example, they've been contracting in police services for a neighboring community for 40 years, and I think they were the first city in California to do that. They also contract in. They also contract in IT services for a number of communities, surrounding communities. What Brea did when they were looking at this more recent fiscal crisis, they began to see this coming down the pike in around 2007. And so the city manager decided to do a very elaborate sort of collaborative strategic planning process, inviting pretty much every employee in the city to take part in it. And they ended up with a fairly stable group of about 40 employees from all levels of city government and all departments who would meet on an ongoing basis for about a year to come up with ideas about how they could restructure the budget, how they could make cuts without really having a terrible impact on services. And they came up with something like 200 plus recommendations, and many of those were implemented. Some of the other things Brea has done is they've created a joint agreement with Fullerton so that they're sharing a command structure for their fire departments. They've saved some money doing that. They've also come up with some new ideas for revenue. And some of these are quite innovative and seem to be fairly successful. So these are both communities, all three actually, agencies that have done a good job, relatively speaking, of addressing their fiscal issues. They all have top bond ratings. They're all, relatively speaking, in good shape, although it's not fair to say that Long Beach is in great shape fiscally, because they've had to make pretty substantial cuts over the last 8 years. But they've been doing it for 8 years, and so they were more able to address the crisis as it occurred this time.
Thank you both Mark and Mike, and let me just ask our three other discussants to just comment on what you've heard, how it relates to your own experience, or how you see the world around us now responding to these issues. And maybe I'll start with Bill. I'm looking you right in the eye here, Bill.
Okay. Would it be better for you if I stood up? Those in the back? Doesn't matter. I'll go ahead. Makes it easier, I think. What comes out to me from the 4 case studies that I've read is, number one, and Mark talked about this, but it really does come through, is the strong leadership structure in each of these entities. Having both staff who have been there, who know their stuff, who exhibit leadership qualities, and who are not afraid to take on transformative ways of doing things and somehow work with their staffs to make that happen. And that it can be very difficult to do because people don't particularly like change. So a little bit at a time, getting people to change the way they do things. That seems to have worked in each of these cases to a great extent. I think transformation is the one word that really comes to me. And this is just my own personal point of view, I truly believe that the way government has always worked is not particularly going to work in the future. We have to transform the way we provide those services, be they at the city, the county, or the school district level. And for each of those entities, it's very different. Cities probably have the most ability to be entrepreneurial, to bring in money, revenues that they normally would not get. And I can speak to that because my city, Brea, which just happens to be one of the ones that were looked at, we were very entrepreneurial. Sometimes it was risky, but if you want to bring in extra dollars, that's what you do to provide the services your community wants. In other cases, school districts are very hamstrung to do that kind of thing because they get their money from the state for the most part. It's pretty prescribed. So how do you do what you do? And Whittier seems to have found, through their leadership and their trust, a very good way of really bringing the community into that and making it their school district, something they really should care about. Counties, again, as we talked about earlier today, they provide services that most of us hope we never have to use. And so it tends to be a different dynamic than a city that provides services that all of us use every single day. So I think these case studies are interesting. They're very different. I'm glad that there was a big city and a smaller city because each do separate things, have the ability to do different things. I'll save some of my questions for later when we get to that, but those were the two main things I got.
Thank you, Bev. Let's see, well, maybe Mark. You'd comment a little bit.
I think that the two things that struck me, one culture, the culture of your organization cannot be underestimated. When our superintendent started 10 years ago, she was very transparent with all of the numbers with our unions, and when the unions came in and asked for a certain amount of money, our superintendent actually was negotiating on their behalf and gave them more than they were asking for because she said we can do it. And you're talking 10 years ago. And from that moment on, I think the culture of Whittier Union changed into more of a partnership, more of a transparent organization that we always sat down with the money. We always said, and we're a really conservative governing board. We're a very conservative fiscal side of our organization. But by doing that, it instilled trust in our associations, in our classified associations and in our teacher associations. So that was 10 years ago. As 2007 hit, and we started to see the economy go, our unions were much more willing to play ball with us and to start talking concessions. We've raised class sizes 3 times in the last 5 years. Teachers willingly saying we'll take more students in our classroom. In 2009, my first month on the job, I had the pleasure of negotiating a 3% salary rollback. And not that we needed the money that year, but as we started looking at the out years, and as Bev pointed out, we're completely state dependent on funds. We can't, go out and make more money. And when you consider for school districts, right now we're facing a 19% deficit factor, which means that we should be making 19% more dollars, 5% of what we should be doing, or 20% of what we should be getting, we're not getting. And then you add into that, we have a 40% deferral on our budgets right now. which means, could you imagine you work this month and your employer says, yeah, you earned that money, we're going to give you that paycheck in 5 months. I don't know about your household, my household couldn't absorb that. But we're very fiscally conservative, so we've been able to absorb that. But my first month on the job, we negotiated a 3% salary rollback, not because we needed it that year, but because as we showed for the sustainability in the district years out, our association saw, and actually when we offered 3%, they wanted to know if we wanted to go 4. And they were saying, is that enough? Is that going to be enough? We raised class size again. A point of trust with our associations. This past year, we froze salaries across the district. We're the only district that I know of in LA County that froze salaries for every employee, and our associations went along with it while raising class size again. And I kind of call our superintendent Obi-Wan Kenobi, because she just says, you don't need to see these people's passes, and they just do those things, but it's really a matter of trust. And Sandy, our superintendent, is embedded in the community. She went to Whittier High School, she taught at Pioneer High School, she was an assistant principal at a school, she was a principal at another school, her daughter went to the 5th school, so she's touched all 5. This is her life, this is her home. And I think that the community feels that. I know our teachers associations feel that. And so as we're continuing to be transparent and the trust is there, our associations know that when we have the money, we're going to be sharing it. And when we don't have the money, we need them to assist us in working together collaboratively to sustain us. The Anderson Center at UCLA says we're not out of this till 2017. We've got a long road to hoe up ahead of us to try and get all the way through this. And it's really the culture, the transparency, and the trust we have with our associations. You know, we're a different industry. 85% of our budget is salary. That's the reality. If we have to cut money, that's the only place we're going to cut money, is salary and benefits. Somebody made the wise decision 1,000 years ago to be a self-funded insurance company. We're our own insurance company for health benefits. We can control our costs more by being our own insurance company. We're not the whim of Health Net or Kaiser or Blue Shield to provide us our insurance coverage. We have enough money in our budget to be self-insured and to sustain that, which saves us, compared to other school districts, a ton of money and really does lead us. And that was done a long time ago in our district to put us in that position. But the trust and the transparency, the conversations, our negotiations are like nothing I've ever sat through. Because we all sit around a table. I'm going back to one at 3 o'clock today where we'll have all 3 of our employee associations sitting together at the table talking about what are the next steps, what is our current budget situation, and what can we do to provide help for our employee associations to keep them moving forward. The other thing we do in education, and we've really kind of screwed ourselves on this, is despite all of those budget cuts, our results continue to improve. And it makes people go, oh, you must not have needed the money anyhow. But I have to tell you, for any educators in the room, none of us went into this job for the money. We went into it to save kids' lives. And how much they pay us to save kids' lives doesn't really matter. It's really about working with kids. And so our results have continued to move forward despite all of the economic turmoil right now.
Thank you very much, Mark. Now, before we follow with questions from throughout the room, I want to turn to Greg. Your perspective on this as you've read the cases, heard the comments, and your role both in the city and now the county.
I think that it's clear to any of us who have been in local government for any period of time that most governments in California are not currently fiscally sustainable. As my good friend Jim Starnberg, longtime city manager in Glendale, and how many other cities, Jim?
47.
And Ron Bates, former city manager in multiple jurisdictions, will tell you that there are those cities and special districts and counties that don't know what their fiscal position is and the level of sustainability they have. And as Jim pointed out this morning, as many or more that don't want to know. I think that unquestionably these kinds of case studies, the principles involved, and the practices of what it takes to be sustainable are valuable. We need a lot more education of governments and people who work in governments about what it takes. But we did conclude that it kind of begged the question, what is sustainability? I think Jim and I both argued strongly that sustainability is not just having a balanced budget. When I was in Ontario for 12.5 years, we understood that cities and counties are built environments. Primary characteristic of anything, any built environment is as soon as something is built, it begins to deteriorate, whether it's private sector or public sector. You need regular investment to maintain it. Now, cities get investment because of the level of services and the amenities available in their communities. You're either getting the investment you need or you're not. You're in competition for that investment. When I was in Ontario, we were really cognizant of the fact that anybody who was going to spend money in our community is a potential investor, whether they're a renter, a homeowner, a home buyer, a shopper, a developer, a business owner. All the people that spend money in your jurisdiction are your investors. You're in competition for that investment. They can invest in Ontario or Chino or Rancho or down in unincorporated Riverside County. They don't have to come to your city. Whether they do depends on those level of services. So I would argue that in order to be sustainable, you've got to be delivering services at a level that attracts that investment. Now, cities are either getting it and they're in upward economic spirals because the more investment they get, the more services and better services and amenities they're able to provide, or they're in downward economic spirals because they're not getting it and they're starting to lose the very tax base and investment that they need to maintain it. So we do think that more work needs to be done on what does it mean to be sustainable, but it's very valuable work to educate all of the people who work in government and the communities that should be holding them accountable.
Rick, well, I've got about a dozen questions I wrote down as they were speaking, but I'm not going to ask them yet. But let's just, first let me just ask if any of the presenters, Mark, and Mike, if you'd like to respond or have a Q&A back and forth here, and then we're going to open it up. So,
I'd like to ask Greg a question. You were mentioning in another conversation that Ontario took a strategy of trying to develop new revenues and was successful in doing that as a way to address fiscal sustainability. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how that worked.
Well, can everybody hear that?
Like Bev mentioned an important term, that Brea was very entrepreneurial. Ontario took the position that we did not want to cut our way into balance, we wanted to grow our way into balance. And we were very aggressive about that. Over 40% of our sales tax, and our sales tax compared favorably with Anaheim, Irvine, Costa Mesa, in fact exceeded on a per capita basis in many instances. So we aggressively sought sales tax. Over 40% came from point of sale industrial as opposed to traditional retail. We actively and aggressively went after that point of sale industrial. And so we were willing to do all kinds of things. When you think of point of sale industrial, the margin of return that they provided versus traditional retail was much greater. Everybody looks at the Ontario mills and they would say to me, oh, how lucky you are, look at that, you know, you've got this wonderful tax generator. But they forget the cost side of it. Ontario Mills had a 20-person police substation. It had the highest fire and paramedic calls. The roads around there, the number of people that came to Ontario Mills was 20 million people a year. Only 16 million people a year go to Disneyland. So the level of cost, yes, it brought in a lot of revenue, but the margin was not very great. If you're getting that same level of revenue, and we were in some of those industrial buildings, the cost is almost nothing. The number of police calls to those industrial buildings, paramedic calls to those industrial buildings was nothing. So we did a number of things, and I could go on, but things like that. We had a very clear business plan for how we were going to achieve sustainability.
Mark.
Yeah, I just wanted to react to an observation that Greg shared with us right now, and that we heard for about, I would say, an hour and a half to 2 hours from our panelists this morning. And that is, fiscal sustainability means that it's necessary for you to balance your budget. But fiscal sustainability is the marriage of two words, fiscal and sustainability. And sustainability in any kind of ecological and economic term means future generations have the same benefit that current generations do to obtain the results of a healthy environment and a viable city, our county, or school district. And so and I didn't reflect that in my overview comments, the sort of triangulation that we got from our peer level. Remember what the purpose of what government is all about. And then the question comes back to, the fundamental question really gets pushed back to, what's the culture, what's the role, and how does government perform, and how can it go through that transformation to fulfill its purpose of sustainability but be fiscally viable. And I think that is really kind of what I heard this morning. And I hope we hear more from you all on some of these difficult issues.
Any others?
Well, there was something you said that I thought was really interesting, and we did talk about this a little bit this morning, but I thought it was so interesting, like to share with all of you. For Mike and for Mark, how well, when you did these case studies, how well did you find that the electeds, at whatever level it was, understood the fiscal plans of the city and the direction their cities were going? Did they have that, did they have that financial fluency that you mentioned? Because it seems to me that is, as a former elected official, my background is not finance. So I had to learn on the job. So I think in a lot of electeds are that way. So.
Mike, you want to start?
I'm not sure to what extent, say, the Long Beach City Council has sort of an expertise in fluency in fiscal issues. What seems to have happened, though, is that they've developed the fluency to understand that they're in a real crisis and that they can't continue as they had before, where there was sort of an interest group approach to how you make the decisions, pressure from the employee unions, and you're representing your district and they're representing theirs. You want your thing and they want theirs. There is a majority consensus now on the Long Beach Council that's working with the city manager and the mayor to work towards what they would consider to be a more sustainable budget. Maria, you could probably speak to that more than me, but it seems to me that there's a very collaborative relationship between the council and the city manager, who's very open and transparent, as your district is, and that they've also developed this sort of expertise from their employee base based on the process that they went through. So it seems like these are both sort of learning communities, and they're kind of developing at least a sort of a baseline understanding of the problem.
Bevan, in LA County, two observations, and one that came from every single person that we interviewed, and that is the most advantageous policy in the County of Los Angeles to enable them to deal with what they had to get their hands around was the absence of term limits. and that they had elected officials that had a sufficient tenure of time and sufficient understanding to deal with the complexities of their budget. Point number one. Point number two, in the late 80s, LA County went through a health crisis task force that almost closed all of our trauma hospitals and would have really put the health system totally underwater in LA County. I mean, it was probably the most severe financial crisis that institution faced. And it's caused by a whole set of intergovernmental policies and a whole set of complexities in their operation I won't bore you with. But what I heard from at least 3 or 4 people that I interviewed, the fact that those elected officials went through that crisis, worked almost for 6 months as financial budget officers, meant they understood that budget backwards and forwards and were fluent, totally fluent in financing. And that was helped by the fact that 2 of the supervisors came off the City Council of LA. Since we're not naming names today, I won't. But 2 of the City Council people came off of LA who were chairman, they were chairman of Keith Comrie's budget committee and vice chairman, and they understood the budget, and they were as fluent as the budget officers and the county exec. That they had that degree of understanding and continuity enabled that county to go through a financial and cultural transformation. Everyone said that.
This is a time to turn to questions, and by the way, just a editorial comment on Mark's comment about the financial wherewithal and the question about it. One of the issues I think going forward for the entire research team is to what extent are these findings out of case studies more generalizable? We'll talk about that later. But questions, please, anyone, or comments? And introduce yourself again.
Okay. Gloria Rubio Cortez at the National Civic League. I wanted to ask Martin about the impact of the 50-member Budget Review Committee in building leadership inside the school and fiscal fluency.
One of the strategies that we employ, we're an organization with about 1,100 employees, was as we wanted to get the transparency message out there and to try and help our associations really get that message out there. Our negotiating teams are quite small. Our classified employees have 3 people on the negotiating team. Our certificated have 4 people on the negotiating team. And when you're trying to get that message out to a large organization, we have 6 different sites, it can become a struggle. So one of our strategies was to get key players off of each of our 6 sites to come together, and we formed a budget review committee. And that budget review committee gets to see each interim report, each unaudited actual report, each final budget report. We show them all of the numbers that we're dealing with in Whittier Union in terms of not just this year. The county requires us to have 3 years of fiscal solvency. We're actually showing a 4th year of fiscal solvency or a deficit. And one of the ways we got to the freeze on the salary schedule is we put up what our budget currently looks like with a deficit out there 4 years from now. And then the Budget Review Committee saw the effect as if we froze salaries right now, not only how it helped us this year, but helped us sustain all the way through 4 years out of being in a positive budget balance. And so they were able to understand those sometimes difficult concepts. When you talk about financial literacy, we tried to help bring classified and certificate employees up to speed on that so that they could go back to the campuses before the elections, before the votes on our contracts, to be able to answer questions. And they were charged not only with taking that information to the different sites, but also to bring back suggestions and ideas. We had suggestion boxes at all the sites. How else do you think we can help manage the budget crisis that we're in? And so it was really a team effort where it wasn't just the superintendent and her cabinet and the negotiating teams, but it was really bringing all 1,100 employees into the fold, into the conversation about our budget and how we're going to sustain what we're doing in Whittier Union.
Questions?
And Dan, you might ask some of the panel members that were there this morning if they had.
I will, but I'm going to ask Paul here right now.
I had a question that also sort of followed up on this, what examples you found of revenue raising at the local level, because it seems to me that we see this sort of paralysis in Washington. I mean, it appears rather obvious that part of the way to grow yourself out of this fiscal mess we're in is to increase revenues. You see paralysis in Washington, a huge reluctance in Sacramento to increase revenues, other than taking what the cities have and maybe pulling some of that back to Sacramento. But what are there creative opportunities? And you mentioned some that the city of Brea exercised, such as mineral rights and a land purchase, and I don't know the details on that. It sounds kind of interesting. And then they negotiated user fees, I guess, for a nearby dump, and that increased revenues. Other examples, and Greg mentioned, pursuing sales tax dollars, not necessarily from retail, but from these wholesalers. Any other examples that you saw that localities were exercising?
Can I start with that? I think generally what made our city, the city of Brea, work so well when we're looking for revenues. And we started many years ago, before I got on our city council. The city manager really said to his staff, with the council's blessing, I want you to be entrepreneurial. Now, understanding that you don't want to piss off your Chamber of Commerce by taking their business, okay? But there are things you can do within a city government setting that can raise revenues. So he basically said to our staff, I want you to take risk. I want you to be risk takers, informed risk takers. And there will be no penalty if you bring something back. We all think it's a really good idea, we've done our due diligence, and maybe it doesn't work, and that happened a couple of times. But for the most part, when we went, we ended up, unbeknownst to us, that we had an 800 megahertz band that most of the cities around us did not have. And at that time, there was a real problem with public safety and being able to get those communications out. So what we did was we worked with Motorola. We came up with a way to get it to all the cities. We held it in-house, and we went and actually sold it to other cities. And it brought in a lot of money. Now, we had to put out a bunch of money to start that up. But that was an informed risk we took, and it has paid off big time for our city and continues to pay off. And there's a piece of that and other things that we've done, such as going with the city of Fullerton on command staff for fire. Cities, I believe, and having been on Mark's regional council at SCAG, I'm an avowed regionalist. I think it makes a lot of sense in many cases. Cities, especially smaller cities, I believe, are going to have to start looking at how do we do things together. What parts of government services would we be better off at a bigger scale? Not a mega scale, but we looked at our Orange County Fire Authority. To us, too big. We lost a lot of control over pensions, equipment, service levels. But we looked and we saw there were a couple cities around us, such as Fullerton and possibly Orange, who have their own fire services. Maybe we could do something with the 3 cities. We'd still we'd have that control with just 3, but we'd save a lot of money. So it's those kinds of things. It's maybe not selling your services, but how can you reduce the cost and keep the same level of service? So those are some of the things we did.
I think Greg wanted to speak to that, and then we'll take more questions.
It's different for every city, and the opportunities are different for every city.
Yeah.
The important part is having a culture and a political leadership, an elected leadership, that is willing to take informed risk. Now, in order to have the kind of money to take those risks, we always talked about, with our unions, the necessity of budgeting with margin. If you're budgeting with margin so that your revenues are exceeding your costs on a yearly basis, that becomes both your cushion for bad times, but it becomes your opportunity money in good times. When I was in Fontana, we bought back some redevelopment junior lien bonds. They were bonds that in the market were not performing very well. They had the payment, they were accruing interest, the payment was, there was no current payment. It was going to be an interest-only payment that was going to start stepping up during the crisis in the early 90s. The market didn't know how to price them. The underlying holders wanted to get rid of them. We bought them back for our general fund. We bought it because we knew we controlled the value. Not only did we understand the instrument, but we actually controlled the value by the level of development that we were going to do in that area. We calculated at the time that we got $10 million worth of bonds for $2.5 million. We calculated at the time between 2010 and 2030 they were going to generate $345 million for the city. Given the run-up in the real estate market, they're going to generate well over $1 billion back to the general fund of Fontana over that period. In the county, we've bought out our own debt. In Ontario, we bought 203 acres of land out next to the mills. We bought that land because the council wanted to build an arena, and we knew that that was going to be very expensive. We knew that we didn't have the capital for it. So we bought the land for under $2 a square foot, and we were relatively heavily criticized at the time. We sold that land anywhere from $12 to $18 a square foot and built a $150 million arena with cash because we didn't want to affect our ongoing costs. So what it means that we bought water rights out of our general fund and sold them back to our own utility. You know, so what it means to the opportunities in each city is are different, but it's a mindset and an approach.
It's empowering your employees to if that idea comes forward or they have an idea, they see something, to bring it back to look at it.
And part of it is getting rid of ongoing costs. It can be equally entrepreneurial.
Yes.
In the county, I just found that out of 9 regional parks, only 4 of them make money, and they're subsidizing the other parks. Well, one of those regional parks happens to be in Ontario, so I said to my park staff, why aren't we letting Ontario have this park? Lease it to them for $1. Let's get out of the business. We're losing $300,000 a year. They will gladly take it because they need more park land. So, I mean, sometimes it's as much, being entrepreneurial can be avoiding costs as much as it can be earning revenue.
I saw several hands up, and I was trying to back.
A couple of responses. One on this note, I think Bev pretty well hit the nail on the head. To me, being entrepreneurial means getting out of the traditional government mode, especially in the general fund operations, of thinking that somebody else raises the money and it's your job to spend it. So that if you're an operating department, you have to start looking at how can your operations either support themselves or support somebody else. I mean, so often a fire department, a police department, they don't see their job as making the resources, their job is spending the resources. So it's getting out of that stereotypical framework, which requires that you be willing to risk, provide support, sometimes you have to be willing to invest capital. A second piece that has struck me in terms of the research propositions you may want to look at, and Martin in particular, I think really brought this home, and that's the role of the employee groups and the unions. I've seen so many situations where success and failure in implementing many of these programs depends on the attitude of the employee groups and the unions. The time you don't want to begin talking to your unions is when you're in trouble. That has to be a very long process of developing relationships. As Martin says, it's about trust. You need to start doing those in good times so that in bad times you have the trust and relationships. And that may be something in terms of the research you want to look a little further at. What in those cities have been successful did they do, not just currently, but have they done over time to develop the trust and the relationships so when things are tough, they can call on their unions and their employees to contribute.
Thanks for those insights.
I wanted to add to what Bev said with respect to regionalism, and we do accomplish some of those savings by contracting. Some of our cities are called contract cities because we do contract for services like fire and police and so forth. So I think we're going to be using that methodology, if you will, but more on a regional basis where we're going to look at our neighbors to do these things. The other things that both Greg and Bev focused on, the business aspect of raising revenues, but I didn't hear yet the nonprofit aspect of raising revenues. In our city, we do have a nonprofit. We as council members sit on the board of the nonprofit to actually help our open space and parks and equestrian trails. I'm a council member, mayor in the city of Rolling Hills Estates, which is on the Palos Verdes Peninsula. And that nonprofit, for the profile of our community, is relatively successful. Now that doesn't mean that it's a one-size-fits-all, that it will work for every community to have a nonprofit to be able to subsidize some of the otherwise services that your general fund or other funds will pay for. But in our case, the intersectoral relation that we have with our nonprofit world, with our community to raise funds, is very beneficial to our community. So I think that aside from the business aspect, we should look at the intersectoral relationship between both the public sector, the private sector, as well as the government sector, and never forget in what ways, thinking outside the box, we can accomplish the same things that we otherwise accomplish.
Well said.
Well, my name is Matt.
I'm sorry, I should be asking, but would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Matt Mornick, and I'm with the City of Santa Monica. At this point, this question might be a little bit repetitive, but it's directed towards Greg and in fact all the panelists. But we've heard a lot of good ideas, revenue generation, being entrepreneurial, organizational culture, but is there anything else that you can illuminate in regards to organizational adaptations to the organizational structure that you foresee we're going to need to make in cities? Because you mentioned earlier, Bev, that we really need to transform the service delivery. So is there anything else you may want to elaborate on, specifically regarding organizational structure?
Well, I think, if I might, I'll just start out that looking a really big deal, and every city is different. If I've learned nothing, I've learned that. Every city is different. Example, when our city looked at, and our fire people were the ones who brought it up, they wanted to look at going with the county. And that seemed like a smart thing to do. Hey, you know, and on paper at first, it was. But then when we started to look into lack of control over the budget, lack of control over pensions, service levels, of course we had a say, but it's a huge entity, and we would be only one of 29. What we did do, though, in deciding to keep it in-house was not to just say, okay, we're going to keep it in-house, and we're going to, you know, lose some folks or lose some service or whatever. How could we, though, take some of what we learned from going through this process and transform our fire department? And how we did it was our city manager was talking to other cities and found out that the city of Fullerton was going to be losing some of their battalion chiefs through retirement, the same as we were. Hello. So they talked, since we're right next door to one another, and we'd already actually been doing this in some cases, couldn't we share battalion chiefs? Save money. So it's thinking out of the box. Instead of our department, we decide, how can we work with others and maybe perform that same service, but more efficient, more effectively, and everybody feels like they have the same. Community has no idea. For the most part, I mean, we've told them, but the community doesn't see any difference in their service level. So it worked out well. That's one thing we did.
Did you want to follow up on that?
Just briefly, in the county, probably next to the cultural change with respect to policy framework, the notion of going to an outcome results integrated decision-making process transform the operations of the county probably more than anything else. And what that meant was various departments needed to solve a particular, or to produce a particular outcome, needed to in fact work together. And eliminating, I mean, it's a pretty traditional approach. You eliminate the stovepipes, but operationally doing it is something very, very different. And how to accomplish that, and I can take you through the amount of monies that were saved on individual decisions, on individual programs, by the county getting various departments to work together. And issues that blew up in the press, and I can take you through the last 10 years of the critical issues that have blown up in the press, what the county is finding that by bringing departments together, they can in fact address the problem. And the most recent one on prisons, if you want to start talking about how are they going to address the issue of state sending prisoners down to the county, if in fact various departments within the county come together, they have a chance of doing it. Whether, I mean, this is the most recent controversy, but the concluding story was how to get the county, 107,000 employees, to work together as one unit is probably the biggest transformation that I found in our research.
I would just say that it's the job and how you define the job, the mission, your operating paradigm, and your culture that drive the structure, not the other way around. Yeah. So you've got to be clear on all of those things. That should drive the structure and how you deliver.
Ron.
Ron Bates, city manager in Pico Rivera, and I just left the city of Southgate as city manager. Just a perspective, I think it was more on the question you asked on long-term financial stability and revenue-raising opportunities. First, I think what you've heard from some of the other city managers who've spoken, that if we're right on the long-term economic future of California and the country, that it'll be more a climate of trying to find ways to effectively deliver service with less resources. Having said that, if you have a strong sense of community, the one big deal that you can pull off, and you can't do this very often, but it is doable. I walked into a situation in Southgate when I became city manager there. The city was in essence worse off than Vallejo, but we didn't have long-term labor contracts in place. So we were able to make some changes. Cutting salaries obviously was one, but the big one on the other side is we got the community to approve on a 72% support of 1 cent city sales tax. That is also the case in Pico Rivera right now. We have a 1 cent city sales tax. So it has to be dire. You have to have strong support and buy-in from the unions. You have to have the business community behind you, and you have to really strategize to get the entire elected groups in the city behind you, any service organizations in that. But it is doable. It can be done. A lot of work, a lot of effort. As I say, it's kind of the ace in the hole, but that will change. That usually brings in enough revenue to change the fiscal how should I, foundation of a city.
We're actually at the end of our time, but I want to take the prerogative just to throwing out a challenge to the research group as a result of what I think are some fascinating illustrations and I mean, Mark, you called them rules or principles that you're starting to identify that make a difference. And they're about leadership and trust and innovation and other really features that I think are important. My question to you collectively is, how do you take this to scale? It goes back to, you chose some, I think, some illustrative, well, maybe you can call them best practices, good practices that we know about. So I just hope the research and the advisory group work with you to think about, that's well and good, it's really very important, it's informative, and how do we go to scale on these? And with that, because it is 1:17 by my wristwatch and we're already beyond what we promised, please join me in thanking the panel.